The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Hayes's corner office on the 42nd floor, each drop like a tiny fist demanding attention he couldn't give. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth $8 billion. Yet tonight he sat alone in his Manhattan penthouse office, staring at a single photo on his mahogany desk. A picture of himself as a child, laughing with parents who died in a car crash when he was 12. The amber glow of his desk lamp cast long shadows across legal documents that would decide the fate of thousands of employees. But all Alexander could think about was the crushing silence that greeted him every night when he returned to his empty Tribeca apartment. His assistant had left hours ago, the cleaning crew had finished their rounds, and the city below pulsed with life he'd forgotten how to live. Alexander loosened his Italian silk tie and rubbed his temples, fighting off another tension headache that seemed to be his only constant companion these days. The success that everyone envied felt like a prison built from expectations and quarterly reports, and lately he'd been wondering what would happen if he just disappeared for a while, if he could remember what it felt like to be human instead of a corporate machine. The next morning brought an unusual decision that would change everything. Alexander woke up in his minimalist bedroom, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, and felt the familiar emptiness settle in his chest like lead. Instead of his usual routine, personal trainer at 6, breakfast prepared by his private chef, car service to the office, he found himself grabbing a simple jacket and walking out onto the streets of New York like any other person. For the first time in years, no one knew where Alexander Hayes was, and the freedom felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He wandered through neighborhoods he'd never seen, despite living in the city for 15 years, eventually finding himself in a modest area of Queens, where the buildings were older, the sidewalks cracked, and children played in small patches of grass between apartment complexes. The contrast to his sterile world of marble and chrome was startling, and for the first time in months, Alexander felt something other than the constant pressure that lived behind his ribs. He stopped at a small diner called Sonny's Kitchen, drawn by the smell of fresh coffee and the warm light spilling onto the sidewalk through windows decorated with hand-drawn signs advertising daily specials. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Alexander was struck by how different this place felt from the exclusive restaurants where he usually ate business meals. Mismatched chairs surrounded tables covered with cheerful yellow tablecloths, and the walls were decorated with children's artwork and photos of what appeared to be regular customers celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. Behind the counter, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail was wiping down surfaces with practiced efficiency, her movements graceful despite the obvious exhaustion in her shoulders. Maya Rodriguez looked up as the stranger entered, noting his expensive clothes, but also something in his eyes that reminded her of her own reflection lately, a deep tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion. At 28, she'd been working double shifts at the diner for 3 years, ever since her ex-husband had left her and their 5-year-old daughter Emma with nothing but unpaid bills and a broken heart. The morning rush had just ended, leaving her with a brief moment to catch her breath before the lunch crowd arrived, and something about this man's quiet demeanor made her offer a genuine smile, despite her own worries. "Good morning," Maya said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of childhood summers in Guadalajara and English learned in New York classrooms. "Would you like a table, or are you eating at the counter?" Alexander hesitated, unused to such straightforward kindness without an agenda behind it. "Counter's fine, thank you." He slid onto a red vinyl stool that had seen better days, but was clean and comfortable, and accepted the menu Maya handed him with another smile that seemed to reach her tired eyes. The laminated pages showed simple fare: pancakes, eggs, sandwiches, with prices that made him realize how disconnected he'd become from how most people lived. "Coffee to start?" Maya asked, already reaching for the pot because everyone wanted coffee on a Tuesday morning in Queens, and this man looked like he hadn't slept well in a very long time. "Please." Alexander watched her pour the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug that had probably been in this diner for decades, and when he took his first sip, he was surprised by how much better it tasted than the elaborate espresso drinks his assistant usually brought him. "This is really good coffee." Maya's smile widened slightly, the first genuine expression of pleasure she'd shown all morning. "My grandmother's recipe. She taught me that coffee should comfort you, not just wake you up." She wiped the counter beside him, and Alexander noticed her hands, small and graceful, but with the calluses and slight burns that spoke of long hours of honest work. "I'm Maya, by the way. I pretty much run this place during the morning shift." "I'm Alex," he said, using the nickname he hadn't heard in years, because everyone in his business world called him Mr. Hayes or Alexander, with careful formality. Something about Maya's genuine warmth made him want to be just Alex for a while, to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a position. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years next month," Maya replied, refilling his coffee without being asked, because she'd learned to read people's needs, from years of serving breakfast to construction workers, nurses getting off night shifts, and elderly people who came in for the company as much as the food. "It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and the owner is decent to work for. Plus Emma, that's my daughter. She can come here after school sometimes when I can't afford a sitter." The mention of her daughter brought a shadow across Maya's face, so brief that most people would have missed it, but Alexander had spent years reading people's micro-expressions in boardrooms and negotiations. He sensed a story there, probably involving struggle and sacrifice, and felt an unexpected urge to know more about this woman who seemed to find genuine joy in making good coffee and treating strangers with kindness. Before he could ask more questions, the diner's front door burst open with the enthusiasm that only a 5-year-old could muster. Emma Rodriguez bounded in, wearing a bright red backpack almost as big as she was, her dark curls bouncing as she ran toward the counter where her mother stood. Her school uniform was slightly rumpled from a morning of playground adventures, and her face lit up with pure joy at seeing Maya, as if they'd been separated for weeks instead of hours. "Mummy," Emma called out, climbing onto the stool next to Alexander, with the fearless confidence of a child who'd been taught that her mother's workplace was a safe haven. "Mrs. Patterson said I drew the best butterfly in the whole class. And look." She pulled a paper from her backpack, unfolding it carefully to reveal a colorful butterfly drawn with the intense concentration only children could bring to their art. Maya's entire demeanor transformed as she looked at her daughter's drawing, her tired features softening into an expression of pure love and pride that made Alexander's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Emma, this is absolutely beautiful," Maya said, taking the paper with the reverence usually reserved for precious artifacts. "We'll hang it right here behind the register so everyone can see it." Emma beamed at the praise, then seemed to notice Alexander for the first time. With the straightforward curiosity of childhood, she studied his face for a moment, before offering a gap-toothed smile that was so genuinely welcoming it made him remember what he'd been like, before the world had taught him to be guarded with everyone he met. "Hi, I'm Emma," she announced, extending her small hand toward Alexander with the formal politeness her mother had obviously taught her. "Are you new here? I know all the regular customers, and I've never seen you before." Alexander shook her tiny hand with gentle solemnity, struck by how different this interaction felt from the calculated networking that usually passed for human connection in his world. "I'm Alex, and yes, this is my first time here. It's very nice to meet you, Emma." "Alex is a nice name," Emma declared, with the authority of someone who'd given the matter serious consideration. "Do you have kids? Because if you do, they should totally come here for pancakes." "My mom makes the best pancakes in the whole world, probably even better than restaurants where famous people eat." Maya laughed, a sound so warm and genuine that Alexander felt something inside his chest loosen for the first time in months. "Emma, You can't go around telling customers that I'm the best cook in the world. What if they expect too much? But you are the best, Emma insisted, with the fierce loyalty that children showed toward their parents. Remember when I was sick last month and you made me special soup? And you stayed up all night even though you had to work the next day? Her voice carried the memory of feeling loved and cared for. But Alexander caught something else in her tone, a child's awareness that her mother sacrificed too much and received too little in return. The conversation was interrupted by the lunch rush beginning to trickle in, and Maya's attention was pulled away by customers who needed orders taken and food prepared. Alexander watched her work, noting how she remembered everyone's usual orders, how she checked on the elderly man eating alone in the corner booth, how she slipped an extra cookie onto a plate for a woman who looked like she'd been crying. There was a grace to her movements and a genuine care in her interactions that spoke of someone who found meaning in taking care of others, even when no one was taking care of her. Emma, meanwhile, had settled beside Alexander with her coloring book and a handful of crayons, chattering easily about school and friends while creating elaborate pictures of houses with too many windows and trees that were purple instead of green. Her presence was surprisingly comforting, reminding Alexander of a simplicity he'd lost somewhere along the way to building his empire. "Alex, do you live around here?" Emma asked, not looking up from her coloring as she carefully stayed within the lines of a butterfly that looked remarkably like the one she'd shown her mother earlier. "No, I live in Manhattan," Alexander replied, realizing that this was probably the longest conversation he'd had with a child since he'd been one himself. "I was just walking around, exploring different neighborhoods." Emma nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. "My mum says Manhattan is where all the rich people live in really tall buildings. She says someday when she saves enough money, we might live in a place with more than one bedroom, maybe even with a little yard where I could have a dog." There was no envy in her voice, just the matter-of-fact way children stated their hopes for the future. The comment hit Alexander unexpectedly hard, making him realize how completely he'd taken his wealth for granted, while this little girl dreamed of something as simple as her own bedroom. He watched Maya work behind the counter, noting the careful way she portioned ingredients and how she kept glancing at the clock, probably calculating how many hours until her shift ended and trying to figure out how to stretch their grocery budget for another week. "What kind of dog would you want?" Alexander asked, finding himself genuinely curious about Emma's answer. "A golden retriever," Emma said immediately, her face lighting up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd given this question considerable thought. "They're big enough to hug, but gentle enough that they won't knock me over, and they have really soft fur. Plus, my friend Jessica has one named Buddy, and he knows how to fetch sticks and sit when you tell him to." She paused in her coloring to look at Alexander seriously. "Do you have any pets?" "No," Alexander admitted, realizing that in all his planning for success and wealth, he'd never considered the simple pleasure of coming home to something that would be genuinely happy to see him. "I travel a lot for work, so I never thought it would be fair to have a pet." Emma nodded understandingly, then returned to her coloring with the intense focus that children brought to activities they truly enjoyed. Alexander found himself watching her small hands work, noting how she bit her lower lip when concentrating and how she hummed softly under her breath. There was something profoundly peaceful about sitting beside this little girl while her mother worked nearby, as if he'd stumbled into a pocket of authentic life that existed apart from the artificial world he'd built around himself. The afternoon passed more quickly than Alexander had expected, and as the diner began to empty out between lunch and dinner service, he realized he'd been sitting at the same counter stool for nearly 4 hours without checking his phone once. Maya had refilled his coffee cup countless times, and Emma had shown him no fewer than 6 completed coloring pages, each one accompanied by a detailed explanation of her artistic choices and color selections. "Mummy, can Alex come to dinner with us tonight?" Emma asked suddenly, looking up from her latest masterpiece with the hopeful expression of someone who'd clearly been thinking about this possibility for a while. I could show him my room, and maybe he could help me practice reading. Mrs. Patterson says I need to read more at home. Maya paused in her cleaning, cloth suspended over the counter as she processed her daughter's unexpected invitation. Alexander saw a flash of something in her eyes, surprise, consideration, and perhaps a hint of loneliness that she quickly tried to hide behind maternal caution. "Emma, honey, Alex probably has important things to do tonight," Maya said gently, though Alexander caught the wistful note in her voice that suggested she might not be entirely opposed to the idea of adult company for dinner. "Besides, we don't really know him well enough to—" "But he's been here all day, and he's really nice," Emma interrupted, with the persistence that came naturally to 5-year-olds who saw the world in simpler terms than adults. "And you always say we should be kind to people who seem lonely, and Alex looks kind of lonely sometimes when he thinks we're not watching." The observation was so accurate and delivered with such innocent directness that Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd thought he was better at hiding the emptiness that seemed to follow him everywhere, but apparently a 5-year-old could see right through whatever mask he wore in public. Maya looked at Alexander apologetically, clearly preparing to make excuses for her daughter's boldness, but he found himself speaking before she could deflect the invitation. "Actually, I don't have anything planned tonight," Alexander said, surprising himself with his honesty. "And I'd love to see Emma's room and help with reading practice, if you don't mind the company." He paused, meeting Maya's eyes directly. "But only if you're comfortable with it. I know it's unusual for a stranger to—" "You're not a stranger anymore," Emma declared with the finality of someone who'd made an executive decision. "Strangers don't know that I want a golden retriever named Buddy Jr., and they don't spend all day coloring with me. You're a friend now." Maya studied Alexander's face for a long moment, and he had the sense that she was weighing more than just whether to trust him with dinner. There was something in her expression that suggested she was tired of being strong all the time, tired of carrying every burden alone, and maybe ready to accept help from someone who seemed to genuinely care about her daughter's happiness. "We don't have anything fancy," Maya said finally, her voice carrying both warning and invitation. "Just spaghetti and salad, probably, and our apartment is pretty small. But if you really want to come, and if you promise you won't judge us for not having much, then yes, Emma would love to have someone new to read to." The relief that flooded through Alexander was so intense it caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had invited him somewhere without wanting something in return? When had he last shared a meal that wasn't a business dinner or eaten food that someone had prepared with love instead of obligation? "I would be honored," he said simply, and meant it more than any acceptance speech he'd ever given at award ceremonies or board meetings. 3 hours later, Alexander found himself climbing 3 flights of stairs in a modest apartment building in Queens, following Maya and Emma toward what the little girl had described as the best apartment on the whole 3rd floor. The building was old, but well-maintained, with narrow hallways that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and the lingering aroma of a dozen different family dinners. Children's voices echoed from behind various doors, mixed with television sounds and the occasional burst of laughter that spoke of families sharing their evening routines. Maya's apartment was indeed small. A living room that doubled as dining area, a tiny kitchen with appliances that had seen better decades, and what appeared to be one bedroom that Emma had obviously decorated with her own artistic sensibilities. But what struck Alexander immediately was how much love had been poured into the space. Every surface held evidence of careful attention. Fresh flowers in a mason jar that served as a vase, Emma's artwork covering one entire wall in a gallery display that rivaled any museum, and furniture that might have been second-hand but was arranged with an eye for comfort and warmth. "Welcome to our palace," Maya said with a self-deprecating smile, hanging her jacket on a hook behind the door and immediately moving toward the kitchen to begin dinner preparations. It's not much, but it's ours. I think it's perfect, Alexander said, and realized he meant it completely. There was something about this space that felt more like home than his multi-million-dollar penthouse had ever managed to achieve. Thank you for having me. Emma immediately took charge of the tour, dragging Alexander by the hand to show him every corner of their small domain. Her bedroom was actually half of the living room, partitioned by a decorative screen that Maya had obviously chosen with care. The small bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade, and every inch of available wall space was covered with Emma's artwork, photographs, and a small collection of books that appeared to have been read many, many times. "This is where I sleep, and this is my reading corner," Emma explained, pointing to a small area with cushions on the floor and a lamp that provided perfect lighting for story time. "And this is my special box, where I keep all my favorite things." She opened a decorated shoebox to reveal what appeared to be a 5-year-old's collection of treasures: smooth stones, interesting leaves, a few small toys, and several photographs. Alexander knelt down to Emma's eye level as she carefully selected items from her box to show him, explaining the significance of each treasure with the serious attention that children brought to their most important possessions. Among the photographs was one that made his chest tighten, Maya and Emma together, both smiling, but Maya's arms wrapped protectively around her daughter in a way that suggested this photo had been taken during happier times. "That's from my birthday last year," Emma said, noticing his attention to the photo. "Mummy surprised me with a cake she made herself, and we had a whole party with just the two of us. She said sometimes the best parties are when it's just the people who love you most." The simple wisdom of that statement hit Alexander harder than any business philosophy he'd ever heard. When had he last celebrated anything with people who loved him rather than people who wanted something from him? When had he last experienced the uncomplicated joy that Emma described so naturally? From the kitchen came the sounds and smells of dinner being prepared, not the elaborate cuisine he was accustomed to, but something that carried the unmistakable aroma of care and attention. Maya was humming softly as she worked, and occasionally her voice would drift over as she asked Emma about her day at school or reminded her to wash her hands before dinner. "Alex, do you want to help me set the table?" Emma asked, apparently having appointed herself as hostess for the evening. "Mommy taught me the right way to put the forks and knives, and I'm really good at folding napkins." They worked together to prepare the small dining table, Emma chattering continuously about everything from her favorite subjects in school to her elaborate plans for when she grew up and became either a veterinarian or an artist, depending on whether she decided she liked animals or drawing better. Alexander found himself genuinely engaged in these conversations, asking questions and offering opinions with an attention he'd never given to the executives who briefed him daily on million-dollar decisions. When Maya called them for dinner, Alexander was struck by how different this felt from every meal he'd eaten in recent memory. The spaghetti was simple but perfectly prepared, the salad fresh and crisp, and the bread came from a local bakery rather than being flown in from France. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere that made this dinner feel like something special. Emma's animated storytelling, Maya's gentle questions about his day, and the sense that all three of them were genuinely happy to be sharing this time together. "So, Alex, what kind of work do you do?" Maya asked as they ate, her tone carefully casual, but Alexander sensed she'd been curious about this question all day. "You mentioned traveling a lot." Alexander paused with his fork halfway to his mouth, realizing this was the moment when he would either continue the fiction of being a regular person or reveal the truth about his wealth and position. Looking at Maya's open, trusting face and Emma's expectant expression, he found himself reluctant to shatter the illusion of normalcy they'd built together. "I work in technology," he said carefully, which wasn't technically a lie, even if it was massively incomplete. Business development mostly. It involves a lot of meetings and travel to different cities. He took a bite of spaghetti, hoping the conversation would move on to safer ground. That sounds important, Emma said with the impressed tone children used when discussing adult jobs they didn't fully understand. Do you help people with computers? Because our computer at school is really slow, and Mrs. Patterson always gets frustrated when she tries to show us websites. Something like that, Alexander agreed, charmed by Emma's interpretation of his career and relieved that she wasn't asking for more specific details. What about you? What do you want to be when you grow up? I already told you, Emma said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow adult. Veterinarian or artist, but maybe both. I could draw pictures of animals and then help them when they're sick, like drawing their sadness away and then giving them medicine. Maya smiled at her daughter's logic, but Alexander caught a shadow of worry in her expression. Emma has a very big imagination, she said fondly. Sometimes I worry she dreams too big for what we can realistically afford. Dreams are never too big, Alexander found himself saying with more intensity than he'd intended. Dreams are what keep us moving forward, even when things are difficult. Maya looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such philosophical depth from someone she'd met serving coffee 12 hours earlier. That's a beautiful way to think about it, she said softly. Sometimes it's hard to keep believing in dreams when you're working 2 jobs just to pay rent and buy groceries. The casual mention of working 2 jobs hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on enjoying Maya and Emma's company that he'd momentarily forgotten the financial struggles that formed the backdrop of their daily lives. While he worried about stock prices and market fluctuations, Maya was working multiple jobs to provide for her daughter, probably sacrificing sleep and personal time to ensure Emma had what she needed. What's your other job? He asked, genuinely curious about how she managed to balance everything he'd observed today. I clean offices downtown 3 evenings a week, Maya replied matter-of-factly, as if this was perfectly normal, rather than evidence of incredible strength and dedication. It's not glamorous, but it pays well enough, and I can do it after Emma goes to bed. My neighbor Mrs. Chen watches her for a few hours while I'm gone. Alexander tried to imagine Maya, exhausted from a full day at the diner, putting Emma to bed and then leaving to spend hours cleaning other people's offices. The mental image made him angry on her behalf, not at her, but at a system that required someone as hard-working and caring as Maya to sacrifice so much just to provide basic security for her child. That must be exhausting, he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral despite the emotions churning in his chest. It is, sometimes, Maya admitted, absently twirling spaghetti around her fork. But Emma is worth any amount of tired, and we're managing okay. We have a roof over our heads, food on the table, and each other. That's more than a lot of people have. Her ability to find gratitude in circumstances that would break many people both inspired and humbled Alexander. How had he spent so many years complaining about problems that were insignificant compared to what Maya faced every single day? When had he become so disconnected from the reality that most people lived with? After dinner, Emma insisted on demonstrating her reading skills, selecting a well-worn picture book about a dragon who learned to make friends instead of frightening people. She read slowly but confidently, occasionally asking for help with difficult words and beaming with pride when Alexander praised her progress. Maya sat beside them on the small couch, her exhaustion from the long day finally beginning to show, despite her obvious happiness at watching her daughter perform for their guest. "This is my favorite book," Emma explained, turning to a page with an illustration of the dragon sharing his treasure with a village of grateful people. It teaches that being nice to people makes you happier than being scary or mean. And look, the dragon realized that sharing his gold made him feel better than keeping it all to himself. The innocent moral lesson felt like a direct challenge to everything Alexander had built his life around. For years, he'd accumulated wealth and power, telling himself that success was its own reward, that building his company was contribution enough to the world. But sitting in this modest apartment, watching a 5-year-old explain the value of kindness and generosity, he began to question whether any of his achievements had brought him the genuine happiness that seemed to radiate from Emma, despite her family's financial struggles. As the evening wound down and Emma began to show signs of tiredness, Maya gently began the bedtime routine that was obviously well established and comforting to both of them. Alexander prepared to leave, thanking them both for the most enjoyable evening he'd had in years. But Emma had other plans. "Alex, before you go, can I ask you something important?" Emma said, climbing onto his lap with the trust that children showed to adults they'd decided was safe. "It's kind of a secret question." Alexander glanced at Maya, who looked as curious as he felt about what her daughter might want to ask privately. "Of course, Emma. What's your secret question?" Emma leaned close to his ear, her small hand cupping around her mouth as if she was sharing something of the utmost importance. When she whispered her question, Alexander felt his entire world shift on its axis. "Mister, can you be my mommy's husband? She cries every night when she thinks I'm sleeping, and I think she's lonely. You seem really nice, and you make her smile in a way that nobody else does." The question hung in the air, like a prayer from a child who had observed more than any 5-year-old should have to, who had noticed her mother's sadness and decided that this stranger who'd spent one day in their lives might be the solution to problems too complex for her young mind to fully understand. Alexander felt his throat close with emotion as he processed not just what Emma had asked, but what it revealed about Maya's private struggles and her own capacity for selfless love. He glanced at Maya, who had obviously heard Emma's whispered question, and was now looking at him with a mixture of mortification and desperate hope that she was clearly trying to hide. The vulnerability in her expression made Alexander's chest ache, and he realized that he'd never wanted anything as much as he wanted to say yes to this little girl's impossible request. But the gulf between his real life and this moment of perfect honesty seemed insurmountable. How could he explain that he was exactly the kind of person Emma would want to protect her mother from? Someone with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Someone whose world was so different from theirs that it might as well be on another planet. How could he tell them that he'd been lying about who he was, even if the person he'd been with them felt more real than anything else in his life? "Emma," he said softly, lifting her small chin so he could look into her earnest brown eyes. "That's the most important question anyone has ever asked me. Can I think about it tonight and give you an answer tomorrow?" Emma nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied that her request was being given the serious consideration it deserved. "Okay, but don't think too long, because tomorrow Mummy has to work late again, and I don't like it when she's sad." Maya walked Alexander to the door, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but her eyes holding something deeper that he couldn't quite interpret. "I'm sorry about Emma's question," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so her daughter wouldn't overhear. "She's very perceptive, but sometimes she says things that are complicated." "Don't apologize," Alexander replied, reaching out to touch her hand briefly before catching himself and pulling back. "She's an amazing little girl, and she obviously loves you very much. That question came from a place of wanting to take care of you, which says everything about how you've raised her." Maya's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Sometimes I worry that she's too aware of things, that she's trying to be the adult when she should just be a kid. But it's been just the two of us for so long, and she's so smart." "She's perfect," Alexander said firmly, "and so are you. Today was the best day I've had in years, and that's because of both of you." As he walked down the 3 flights of stairs and out into the evening air of Queens, Alexander felt like he was leaving something essential behind. The contrast between Maya's warm, love-filled apartment and his own sterile penthouse had never been starker, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood the difference between having everything and having what mattered. His phone had been buzzing all evening with missed calls and urgent messages from his assistant, board members, and various executives who needed decisions on matters that had seemed crucial this morning, but now felt utterly insignificant. As he scrolled through emails about quarterly projections and merger discussions, all he could think about was Emma's serious little face, asking if he could be her mother's husband, and Maya's quiet strength in building a beautiful life, despite circumstances that would have defeated someone with less courage and love. That night, Alexander sat in his Manhattan penthouse, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the lights of Queens in the distance, and he found himself wondering what Maya and Emma were doing in their small apartment. Whether Maya was indeed crying as Emma had observed, and whether there was any way for someone like him to become part of something as real and beautiful as what they'd built together. For the first time in 20 years, Alexander Hayes fell asleep, thinking about something other than business. He dreamed of golden retrievers and hand-drawn butterfly pictures, of spaghetti dinners and bedtime stories, and of a little girl who believed that love could solve any problem if the right person was brave enough to try. 3 days later, Maya was beginning to think she'd imagined the entire encounter with Alex. Emma asked about him constantly when he was coming back, whether he'd thought about her important question, and if he'd forgotten about them already. Maya found herself watching the diner's door more carefully than usual, hoping to see his familiar figure, but telling herself it was probably better if he didn't return. People like Alex, well-dressed, articulate, obviously from a different world, didn't usually stick around places like Sonny's Kitchen or get involved with single mothers working 2 jobs to make ends meet. But on Thursday morning, just as Maya was beginning to accept that their magical evening had been a one-time occurrence, the bell above the diner door chimed, and Alex walked in looking like he hadn't slept well in days. He wore the same expensive clothes, but his hair was slightly rumpled, and there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before, as if he'd been wrestling with something important and had finally reached a decision. Emma, who had been coloring at the counter while waiting for school to start, looked up, and her entire face transformed with joy. "Alex, you came back. Did you think about my question? Because I've been thinking about it too, and I have some more things to tell you about why you should marry my mommy." Maya felt heat flood her cheeks, but Alex smiled at Emma with such genuine warmth that some of her embarrassment faded into something that felt dangerously like hope. "I did think about your question," Alex said seriously, taking the same stool he'd occupied 3 days earlier and accepting the coffee Maya poured without being asked. "And I have some things I need to tell both of you. Important things about who I really am." The serious tone in his voice made Maya pause in her coffee pouring, and she studied his face carefully. There was something different about him today, a weight that seemed to press on his shoulders, and a nervousness that suggested whatever he needed to tell them was significant and potentially life-changing. "Are you in trouble?" Emma asked with the direct concern that children showed when they sensed adult worry. "Because if you are, maybe we can help. Mommy is really good at solving problems, and I'm good at making people feel better when they're sad." Alex laughed, but the sound carried more emotion than humor. "You're both already helping more than you know. But Emma, what I need to tell you might change how you feel about me, and I need you to know the truth before I can answer your question properly." Maya felt her stomach tighten with anticipation and a growing sense that whatever Alex was about to reveal would explain the contradictions she'd noticed about him. The expensive clothes and educated speech that didn't quite match his humble behavior, the way he seemed unfamiliar with normal prices and everyday struggles, and the careful way he'd answered questions about his work. "The truth is," Alex began, looking directly at Emma and then at Maya, "my real name is Alexander Hayes, and I'm not just someone who works in technology. I own a technology company, a very large technology company. Emma blinked at him with the confusion of someone trying to process information that didn't quite compute. So you're like the boss of computers? Something like that, Alexander said gently. Emma, the company I own is worth billions of dollars. I live in a penthouse in Manhattan. I have more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and until 3 days ago, I had convinced myself that success and wealth were enough to make a person happy. Maya felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of what he was saying began to sink in. This man, who had sat in her modest diner, eaten her simple cooking, and played with her daughter in their tiny apartment, wasn't just from a different world. He was from a completely different universe of wealth and power. She gripped the edge of the counter, trying to process why someone like Alexander Hayes would have spent time with them, what he could possibly want from people who had nothing to offer someone of his stature. But here's the most important part, Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. The person I was with you, the person who colored with Emma and helped set your table and read bedtime stories, that was the most real I've felt in 20 years. You didn't see Alexander Hayes the billionaire. You saw Alex, just Alex, and you welcomed him into your home and your life without asking for anything in return. Maya stared at him, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile the man sitting at her counter with the image of a tech billionaire she'd occasionally seen on business news. Alexander Hayes, she repeated slowly, and suddenly the expensive clothes and educated manner made sense, along with his unfamiliarity with normal prices and working-class struggles. You're really him. I am, Alexander confirmed, his eyes never leaving her face as he tried to read her reaction. And I know how this must look. Rich man comes slumming in Queens, plays pretend with the poor family, gets his entertainment and moves on. But Maya, I swear to you, that's not what this was. When I walked into this diner, I was the loneliest person in New York City. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Emma, who had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, finally spoke up. Wait, so you're super rich, like Batman rich? Despite the tension crackling between her and Alexander, Maya couldn't help but smile at her daughter's frame of reference. Yes, honey, probably richer than Batman. Cool, Emma said with the enthusiasm of someone who had just learned something fascinating rather than world-altering. So, does this mean you could buy me a golden retriever? Because that would be awesome, but also, I still think you should marry my mommy because she needs someone to love her, and money can't hug you when you're sad. The simple wisdom of Emma's response seemed to break some of the tension in the room, and Alexander felt a surge of love for this little girl who could learn that her new friend was a billionaire and still focus on what really mattered, her mother's happiness and the emotional connections that made life worth living. Emma's right, Alexander said, turning back to Maya with desperate honesty in his voice. Money can't hug you when you're sad. It can't sit with you while you color pictures or make spaghetti taste better or turn a small apartment into the warmest home I've ever experienced. You and Emma gave me something I'd forgotten existed, the feeling of being wanted for who I am rather than what I can provide. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she processed the weight of what he was saying. But Alexander, don't you see how impossible this is? You live in a penthouse and own $1 billion company. I work 2 jobs and worry about paying rent. We're not from the same world. No, Alexander said firmly, standing up from his stool and moving closer to where Maya stood behind the counter. We're not from the same economic bracket, but we're absolutely from the same world. We're both people who've been hurt, who've been lonely, who've been looking for something real in a world full of artificial connections. The difference is that you've managed to build something beautiful despite having every reason to be bitter, while I've had every advantage and still managed to create nothing meaningful until I met you. Emma climbed down from her stool and moved to stand between them, looking up at the 2 adults with the seriousness of someone who understood that important decisions were being made. Mummy, Are you scared because Alex has lots of money? Because Mrs. Chen always says that good people are good people no matter how much money they have, and Alex is definitely good people. Maya knelt down to Emma's eye level, her voice gentle but troubled. It's not that simple, baby. When people have very different amounts of money, it can make relationships complicated. Alex lives in a world where people might not understand why he'd want to be with us, and we live in a world where people might think we only want to be with him because of his money. But that's stupid, Emma declared, with the blunt honesty that only children could get away with. We liked Alex before we knew he was rich, so obviously we like him for Alex reasons, not money reasons. And if his rich friends don't like us, then they're not very good friends anyway. Alexander felt his chest tighten with emotion at Emma's straightforward logic. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults seem to complicate beyond recognition. Emma, you're absolutely right. And Maya, I know this is complicated, and I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I was afraid you'd see the money instead of seeing me. And for the first time in my adult life, someone was seeing me. Maya stood slowly, studying Alexander's face as if trying to memorize every detail. What are you asking from us? What do you want this to be? I want everything, Alexander said honestly. I want to come home to both of you every night. I want to help Emma with her homework and listen to her read stories. I want to worry about whether she's making friends at school and celebrate when she draws butterfly pictures. I want to hold you when you're tired from working too hard, and I want to be the person you turn to when things get difficult instead of carrying everything alone. He paused, looking at Emma and then back at Maya. But more than that, I want to build something real with you. Not me taking care of you because I have money, but us taking care of each other because we choose to be a family. I want Emma to grow up knowing that love is what makes people belong together, not financial security or social expectations. Maya felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks as she listened to Alexander paint a picture of the life she'd dreamed about but never allowed herself to believe might be possible. And what about your world, your business, your colleagues, the society pages that will have a field day when Alexander Hayes starts dating a diner waitress with a 5-year-old daughter? Let them talk, Alexander said, with more conviction than he'd felt about anything in years. Maya, I've spent 2 decades building a company and a reputation based on what other people expected from me. I'm tired of living my life according to other people's definitions of success. You and Emma have shown me what actually matters, and I'm not giving that up because some socialites think you're not good enough for me. Emma tugged on Alexander's sleeve, demanding his attention with the urgency of someone who had something important to add to the conversation. Alex, if you marry my mommy, does that mean you'd be my daddy? Because I never had a daddy before, and I think I'd like having one if it was you. Udin. The simple question broke Alexander's heart and healed it simultaneously. Looking at Emma's hopeful face, he understood that he wasn't just falling in love with Maya. He was falling in love with the idea of being the father this incredible little girl deserved, of being part of something bigger and more important than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Emma, if your mommy says yes, I would be honored to be your daddy, Alexander said solemnly. And that would mean protecting you and loving you and being there for you no matter what for the rest of my life. Emma beamed at this answer, apparently satisfied that all the important details had been addressed to her satisfaction. Mummy, I think you should say yes. Alex makes you smile, and he's really good at coloring, and he didn't get annoyed when I asked him a million questions. Plus, then we could get a golden retriever. Maya laughed through her tears, amazed by her daughter's ability to reduce life's most complex decisions to their essential emotional components. But as she looked at Alexander's face, really looked at him, past the expensive clothes and the revelation of his wealth, she saw the same gentle man who had spent an afternoon coloring with her daughter and an evening helping with homework. Money might change circumstances, but it didn't change the kindness in his eyes or the way he looked at Emma like she was precious beyond measure. "Alexander," she said slowly, "if we do this, if we try to build something together, I need you to understand that I won't be your charity case or your social experiment. I'm a strong woman who's been taking care of herself and her daughter for years, and I need to be an equal partner in whatever we build, even if our bank accounts will never be equal." "Maya, you're the strongest person I've ever met," Alexander replied without hesitation. "You've built a beautiful life and raised an amazing daughter with courage and grace that I've never possessed. I don't want to rescue you. I want you to teach me how to live the way you do, with purpose and love and genuine connection to what matters." Emma, apparently tired of all the serious adult conversation, decided to take matters into her own small hands. She grabbed both Alexander's hand and Maya's hand, pulling them together with the determination of someone who had already decided how this story should end. "Okay, so Alex loves Mommy, and Mommy loves Alex, and I love both of you, and we all want to be a family," she announced with the authority of someone who had solved a complex problem through pure logic. "So can we please stop talking about money and scary stuff and go get ice cream to celebrate? Because Mrs. Patterson says when good things happen, you should celebrate with ice cream." Maya and Alexander looked at each other over Emma's head, and suddenly both of them started laughing, not from humor, but from the relief of realizing that sometimes the most complicated problems really did have simple solutions. Love was love, family was family, and everything else was just details that people who cared about each other could figure out together. "Ice cream sounds perfect," Maya said, reaching up to wipe the tears from her cheeks. "But first, I think Alex owes Emma an answer to her original question." Alexander knelt down so he was at Emma's eye level, taking her small hands in his larger ones with the solemnity that such an important moment deserved. "Emma Rodriguez, would you like me to marry your mommy and be your daddy?" "Yes!" Emma shouted with the enthusiasm of someone who had just gotten exactly what she'd been hoping for. "But also, can we get a dog now? Because families should have dogs, and I've been really patient about waiting for one." "We can definitely talk about getting a dog," Alexander laughed, standing up and pulling both Maya and Emma into a hug that felt like the first real moment of his adult life. "But first, I think your mommy and I should probably go on a few dates and figure out how to plan a wedding." 6 months later, the gossip columns were still trying to make sense of how tech billionaire Alexander Hayes had fallen in love with a Queen's diner waitress. But Alexander had stopped reading them weeks ago. He was too busy learning how to braid Emma's hair for school and helping Maya plan the expansion of Sunny's Kitchen into the successful restaurant she'd always dreamed of owning. Their wedding had been small and perfect, held in the community center near Maya's apartment, with Emma as the flower girl and half the neighborhood in attendance. Alexander's business associates had been shocked by his choice of venue and bride, but the few who attended had to admit they'd never seen him look happier than when he was dancing with his new wife, while Emma spun in circles around them, her laughter filling the room with joy. Emma now had her golden retriever, a gentle giant named Buddy, who slept on her bed and walked her to school every morning. She also had a father who read her bedtime stories, helped with homework, and never missed a school play or art show. Alexander had discovered that being Emma's dad was his greatest professional achievement, worth more than any board position or industry award he'd ever received. Maya and Alexander had found their rhythm as partners, with her strength and wisdom balancing his resources and ambition. Together they'd created something neither could have built alone, a family based on love and mutual respect, a business that served their community with dignity and care, and a home where money was useful, but love was essential. On quiet Sunday mornings, when Emma was playing with Buddy in their backyard, and Maya was reading the newspaper with her feet tucked under her, Alexander would sometimes remember the lonely man who had wandered into a Queen's diner 6 months ago, looking for something he couldn't name. That man had been successful by every measure society used, but he'd been bankrupt in the ways that actually mattered. Now watching his wife smile at something in the morning paper while his daughter taught their dog to fetch, Alexander understood what wealth really meant. It wasn't about numbers in bank accounts or properties owned or companies controlled. Wealth was Emma running to hug him when he came home from work, Maya's hand in his as they watched their daughter sleep, and the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people who needed him as much as he needed them. Sometimes a simple question from a 5-year-old really could change everything. Sometimes the best business decision a man could make was to choose love over logic, family over finance, and a life measured in hugs and bedtime stories rather than quarterly profits and board meetings. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you might find yourself sitting at a diner counter in Queens, drinking the best coffee you'd ever tasted, while a little girl asked if you could be her mommy's husband, because she'd noticed that everyone deserved to be loved. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that true wealth lies in the moments of human connection that money can't buy, please like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here we tell stories that warm the heart, restore your faith in humanity, and remind us of what truly matters. Because sometimes the richest people in the world are those who have the least in their bank accounts, but the most love in their hearts. Until next time, keep being kind, keep believing in love, and remember that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choosing to care for each other, one story at a time.